see if this works. It is on. There we go. Okay. So if you're watching online, you actually can't see it, but it's standing room only in the auditorium because they heard I was teaching. So Troy went out to the foyer to sell tickets because there's a line waiting to get in. So if you want to attend next week, you better come early to get a seat. So we're going to be learning about Paul's letter to the church in Philippi, but we're actually not going to start in Philippians because as far as I'm concerned, you can't understand the letters without understanding where they fit. And so we're actually going to start this introduction in the book of Acts. So I'm going to go through that with the purpose of making sure that we know where everything fits. Because as I taught Acts to the auditorium class 4 times in a row, I think it really provides the context for all the epistles. So you have really the 4 gospel accounts, and then you have the Acts, and then you have everything else that fits into the Acts, and then you have Revelation. So if we're going to study one of those letters, then I think it's appropriate that we know where it fits. And if the writing on the screen, maybe you can read that. So we'll go through it. If not, then I'll try to blow it up next time. So you can probably see that. So what I've done, and these chapters are not exactly, as Jack has said in the past, sometimes the chapter breaks aren't exactly where they should be. For instance, chapter 8, verse 1, it clearly should be in chapter 7. So when it says Saul is consenting unto his death, talking about Stephen being stoned, that should really be in chapter 7. So these chapters, and that's what they are, the way I have them numbered, aren't exactly right, because sometimes there's a little bit of overlap either before or after in the chapters. But even so, this is a very shortened, abbreviated summary of really Acts. And so if I want to think about where to find something in the book of Acts, I kind of have this in my head, and the way I do that, it's really the missionary journeys in the last part of Acts. It really helps to say, well, I know it's in this account, this missionary journey, and it's in these chapters, and you can go very quickly to find it. So the book of Acts, I've got it summarized really like this. So chapter 1 is essentially the ascension of Jesus Christ. Chapters 2 through 6 is just the growth of the church. Peter's sermon on the day of Pentecost, the growth of the church, how many are baptized, 3,000 are added to the church, and then it just continues to grow. We don't know exactly how much time period is covered in those chapters, because sometimes we have summary verses that just say, and the church continued to grow. So we don't know exactly how long it is. Chapter 7 is really Stephen's defense of the gospel, and then at the end he is stoned for his defense. If you want to learn the Old Testament, a good thing to do is to read Acts chapter 7, because Stephen basically starts from the start of the Israelite nation and goes all the way through the Old Testament. By the time he gets to Jesus Christ, they stone him. So if you want to have a good summary of the Old Testament, of those 39 books or so, just read Acts chapter 7, because Stephen goes through it pretty quickly. Then you have Philip, where he goes to the Ethiopian eunuch, and really his evangelistic travels there. We have a brief interlude with Saul and his Jesus appearing to him on the road to Damascus, and them going into Damascus and being baptized there. Then we have the travels of Peter, and then Peter and Paul, they kind of overlap with 11 and 12. So that's the first half of Acts. And if you have that in your mind, it's really easy to find if you're looking for a particular verse or scripture or an account about a certain event. The last part of Acts is actually very easy to remember if you will just take the 30 seconds or so to try to commit it to memory. So 13 and 14 is the first missionary journey. 15 is the Jerusalem Council where they go and say, do we still have to be circumcised? And they go and take people to Jerusalem and determine, of course, you don't. 16, 17, 18 is the second missionary journey. 19, 20, 21 is the third missionary journey. 22 through 26 is when Paul's imprisoned, not yet traveled to Rome, but it is in custody, essentially, in Jerusalem, and then they take him to Caesarea. He spends the better part of 2 years in Caesarea. And then 27 and 28 is his journey to Rome, and then being on house arrest in Rome. So if you're thinking about where do these things fit, it's a good thing to know those things. So it's 2 chapters, 1 chapter, 3, and then 22 through 26, and then 27 and 28. So you kind of group those together, and if you actually get down and look at the scriptures themselves, then you're going to see that there's a little bit of overlap, and those chapters don't exactly line up. I didn't put the chapters there. Somebody else did. I would have put them probably in a different place. But that helps us understand a little bit about the context of the Acts. And as you know, the church in Philippi was established on one of Paul's missionary journeys. Does anybody know which one? Somebody knows. Yeah, so it's on the, and if you can't see online, the entire crowd yelled out the second missionary journey. And they're exactly right. So the crowd is right on point. So what I want to talk about now is the church in Philippi, and that it's established. It was established on the second missionary journey. It's established according to my dates, and I've seen different dates, and you don't know exactly when, because we don't have an exact chronology in the book of Acts to know how much time passes, for instance, before the stoning of Stephen, and then they departed from Jerusalem. You know that in Acts chapter 1, verse 8, where it talks about that you will be witnesses to me in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. We don't know exactly how long it took them to go out from Jerusalem. We know what happened after the stoning of Stephen, but we don't know after that how long that took. So these are somewhat of guesstimates as far as the dates. Paul's second missionary journey, according to my dates, would have been in the early 50s, 50 to 53, thereabouts. People smarter than me that have done a lot more study on Greek and other sources have provided those dates to me. I have not independently verified them. What we're going to talk about in Acts, if we get to it, which we should tonight, is the establishment of the church in Philippi, and that is in Acts chapter 16. As I just went through for you, the first missionary journey is 13 and 14, Jerusalem Council is 15, second missionary journey is 16, 17, 18. Third missionary journey is 19, 20, 21. So we know if it's on the second missionary journey, it's going to be in 16, 17, 18. Okay, it's in chapter 16. So it's towards the beginning of his second missionary journey, and I'll show you those maps in just a second. So we don't know exactly who was with Paul when he established the church in Philippi, but we do know that there are some who certainly were with him. So if you remember about the first missionary journey, who was Paul's primary travel companion? Paul and Barnabas, right? So after the first missionary journey, during the first missionary journey, who left them? Who departed and went back home? Right, John Mark. So there was a dispute, and if you look in the book of Colossians, you'll know that Barnabas and John Mark were related. They were cousins. And so there's a dispute. I don't know if that's exactly why Barnabas took John Mark with him, and then Paul chose Silas on the second missionary journey. But you'll see at the end of chapter 15 that there's a dispute over John Mark, and that Paul goes a different way than what he was planning. He was actually planning to sail back over to Cyprus and basically retrace his steps for the first missionary journey, but instead, Barnabas and John Mark went that way. We don't have any, at least in the scriptures, we don't, of the recording of their missionary journey or journeys after that. We just don't know. There may be other sources, but I'm not aware of them. But instead, Paul took Silas and then went up through to the north of Antioch, because they always started in Antioch. So they leave Antioch, and I'll show you that in just a second on this map. But we know that during that, so Paul took Silas with him, and then Timothy joins them shortly after they begin their second missionary journey. And we know who penned the book of Acts. Luke, right? So, and if you're watching online, the entire crowd yelled, Luke penned it. So Luke penned the book of Acts, and so we know when he uses the word we went, he's including himself, and so we know that Luke was there with them as well. We know certain things about the city of Philippi, that there was no synagogue there. My commentary actually says that they would only build a synagogue in a city if there were at least 10 families there. I don't know if that's right or not, but what we do know is that if there was not a synagogue, then they would usually go to a common place, usually by the riverside, to have prayer and other worship. And that's what they do. So if you've read and studied from Paul and his missionary journeys, you know that every time he entered a city, if they had a synagogue, that's exactly where he went. He would always go to the synagogue. Sometimes he would get kicked out, and then he would have to go somewhere else. But he would go to the synagogue. Well, here in Philippi, there is no synagogue, so he goes to where they're worshiping, which is by the riverside. So we know there's no synagogue. It's a Greek city, and we know that it is a major center of trade because it's on a major thoroughfare through the area. He revisited Philippi during his third missionary journey, but we're almost told that in passing. And if we have time, I'll show you that. It's almost like Philippi's not even mentioned. It just says he goes through the region. So we don't know how much time he spent at the church in Philippi on his third missionary journey, but the trek for his third missionary journey was very similar to his second missionary journey. So if you can see that, this is, and it shows up more in color on the back screen, but it's bigger on the front screen. So it may be a little difficult for you to see, but this is modern day Mediterranean Sea. So it gives you some idea. I don't know, is there a pointer on this, Troy? No, yeah, okay. So I'm going to try to stay next to the mic. So down here on the right-hand side is Israel. So the first mission, all of Jesus's ministry, his entire life was essentially in this little area where I'm pointing the green dot. I mean, right at the end of the L of Israel. I mean, that's Jesus' entire life. Paul's first missionary journey kind of goes up through what is modern-day Turkey and then comes back through this little area. The second and third missionary journeys come up through here, what was Macedonia and now is Greece, and then he returns, and Antioch is up here now north of Lebanon, kind of in the Syria, modern-day Syria. When he goes to Rome, it's all the way over here, of course, in Italy. He had wanted to go to Spain. So that kind of gives you an idea. What I'm going to show you the next maps, it will be more centered in this area, and you'll be able to see the missionary journey. So this is the first missionary journey. You can see it's more, it's a smaller area, and this is where we think that the churches of Galatia were established, this mainly in Asia Minor. And so this is where he travels with Barnabas. And then this is the second missionary journey, and you'll see that way up here at the top of the screen is Philippi. So he's starting in Antioch, and instead of sailing back to Cyprus, he goes up to Tarsus, Derbe, Lystra, a different Antioch. This is the Antioch where he starts. Antioch of Galatia, Troas, he sails to Neapolis. They go through just past this island and then immediately go to Philippi. So that's where we're going to be starting. So this is really, Acts chapter end of 15, and then this is all 16 where he's traveling. So we'll talk about that for just a second. So you know kind of where it fits in the New Testament. This is his third missionary journey, which you can kind of see also. He travels, I'll back up for you. So that's the second, and that's the third. It looks quite similar. I mean, he's going to the same areas, and you can see on the third missionary journey that it looks like he is going through Philippi, but Philippi is actually not mentioned in the scriptures as him going through it, but it's the same area where he traveled. So those are the missionary journeys. This is his journey to Rome, which was primarily by boat, was not really over the land. And as you know, he was had quite the rough trip to Rome. But eventually made it. That's Acts 27 and 28. And we're not told much after that. All right. So let's go to the book of Acts and talk about the city and the conversions and the establishment of the church, because I don't think you can really understand the book, the letter to the church in Philippi without understanding this background. So let's go to Acts chapter 16. And what I'm going to do is back up just a little bit and point some of the verses out to you. I'm not going to read it, all of them to you. But if you back up to Acts chapter 15, the end of chapter 15, verses 36 to the end of the chapter, you'll see that there was a division over John Mark. Barnabas wanted to take John Mark again, give him another chance. Paul didn't want to give him another chance. And so there's a dispute. You can see in verse 39, the contention became so sharp that they parted from one another. And so Barnabas took Mark and sailed to Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and departed, being commended by the brethren to the grace of God. And he went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. So instead of sailing back to Cyprus as he had originally planned, he takes Silas and then goes north, and Barnabas and John Mark sail to Cyprus. So, it's one of those things that, if I were writing or had the option of what do we get to know, I would want to know what happened with Barnabas and John Mark, but we're just simply not told. So I can only presume that we're not supposed to know that. So we don't know what happened to them, but we do know the travels of Paul. So at the first part of chapter 16, they find Timothy, and as you know, Timothy really sticks with Paul almost really for the rest of his life. Now, Timothy is a messenger in some circumstances and goes and delivers messages and comes back, but Timothy was a true son in the faith to Paul, and this is probably the beginning of a very long and beautiful relationship between the two of them. And so you'll see in chapter 16, verse 1, he came to Derbe and Lystra, and behold, a certain disciple was there named Timothy, the son of a certain Jewish woman who believed, but his father was Greek. So Timothy joins them here in Lystra on their journey. So he's converted to Christianity and joins them. And then if you look now over in verse 6, it says, now when they had gone through Phrygia and the region of Galatia, now remember, Galatia was where Paul had visited on the first missionary journey. So he's going back through there, but he's continuing. They were forbidden by the Holy Spirit to preach the word in Asia, which would have been up north of where they were going. Verse 7, and they had come to Mysia. They tried to go to Bithynia, but the Spirit did not permit them. So passing by Mysia, they came down to Troas, and a vision appeared to Paul in the night. A man of Macedonia stood and pleaded with him, saying, come over to Macedonia and help us. Now after he had seen the vision, immediately we sought to go to Macedonia. So what does that tell you about that word, we? Luke. Luke is there. So Luke's there. So now we at least have Paul, Silas, Timothy, Luke on this missionary journey. So we sought to go to Macedonia, and concluding that the Lord had called us to preach the gospel to them. So here we are, and starting in verse 11, this we're going to slow down just a little bit. So this is where the church in Philippi is established. This is a very well-to-do, kind of a big city. I mean, this is what you would think of as a city. I mean, this is not, hole in the wall. This is not a single, stop sign kind of town. This is a big thoroughfare, a lot of trade going on. So you'll see that. So verse 11, then sailing from Troas, we, again, Luke with them, we ran a straight course to Samothrace, which is that little island. I'll back up, see if I can show you again. So if you look, it's kind of hard to see, but it's right there, right above where it says Aegean Sea. That's the island. No, that was on the journey to Rome. So that's the fourth missionary journey or journey to Rome. So they go up to Neapolis and then straight course over to Philippi. So that's where we are. So he's, as you've probably recognized, the cities as he went, rather than sailing to Cyprus, he went up through Galatia. The Spirit prohibited him from going to Asia, and so he continued to Troas, Samothrace, and then Neapolis, and then to Philippi. So we're now up in Philippi. He's converted Timothy. So Timothy has joined him, right, in Lystra. So Timothy's joining him right here and is continuing on. Luke is with them, and Silas is with them. So we're now in this big city, and he's going to do what he does. Paul does what he does. He starts preaching the gospel. So that's where we are. So verse 12, and from there to Philippi, which was the foremost city in that part of Macedonia, a colony. And we were staying in that city for some days, and on the Sabbath day, which would be which day? That's right, our Saturday, right? The seventh day of the week. On the Sabbath day, we went out of the city to the riverside where prayer was customarily made, and we sat down and spoke to the women who met there. Now he's at the river place, so if there had been a synagogue, he would have been at the synagogue. But this is where they go when they don't have a synagogue. So this is a big city with really not a lot of Jews. I mean, this is primarily Greek. So you got just a few Greek people, Jewish people that are meeting together at the riverside, and that's where Paul goes. So he's preaching where the Jews are. We sat down and spoke to the women who met there. Verse 14, now a certain woman named Lydia heard us. She was a seller of purple from the city of Thyatira, who worshiped God. The Lord opened her heart to heed the things spoken by Paul. And when she and her household were baptized, she begged us, saying, if you have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come to my house and stay. So she persuaded us. So this is the first conversion that we have in Philippi. What do we know about this woman? We know a couple of things about her. So we know her name, right? Her name is Lydia. We know where she's from, right? She's from Thyatira. And we know what she was doing, what her trade was. What does her trade tell you about her wealth? Probably wealthy, because, it's purple, right? And so purple, the very bright colors, that kind of stuff, those goods would be very expensive. And so she is selling very expensive goods. And so most likely a very wealthy woman. What's interesting is we see this when he went to the riverside, we're told specifically who was meeting there. The women, that's right. It says the women. And then his conversion is of her and then her household. So, I'm sure there's a lesson there to be learned for us that, you can't judge a book by its cover and thinking about, the genders and what we're going through today. Paul was no respecter of persons when he's going to preach the gospel. It didn't matter to him. And so he's preaching, and in fact, the Lord opened up her heart, Lydia's heart, to it. And then obviously, somehow the rest of her household is also taught and is baptized. Another great example of immediately after they're taught that they are baptized. So we have one household here in Philippi that is converted. And so we've basically now got a little bitty house church in a very big Greek city, okay? So even so, we've got somebody that is most likely on the upper class as far as wealth. So Lydia and her household are baptized. She asked them to stay. So we know there's at least 4 of them who are likely staying, unless, there's obviously the possibility that one of them has departed or gone on a little trek and come back or something, but we're given no indication that Silas has gone away or Timothy's not with them, and we certainly know Luke is there because he keeps referring to himself in the first person as having been with them. So we have this conversion, so we've got a little bitty house church. So that'll give you some idea of when we read the letter to the church in Philippi, at least part of who he's writing to, right? So we have Lydia and her household. Any questions, comments about that? So we got little bitty house church that's probably got a good amount of money, all right, in a big metropolis Greek city. That's where he starts. All right, so he's been persuaded. He's going to stay at their house and stay a little while. So this is the next interesting story, account of what happens to Paul and Silas. And it's interesting to me, and I'll share for you why in just a second. So picking up in verse 16 of Acts chapter 16, it says, "Now it happened as we," so Luke is still with them, "as we went to prayer, that a certain slave girl, possessed with a spirit of divination, met us, who brought her masters much profit by fortune-telling. This girl followed Paul and us and cried out, saying, 'These men are the servants of the Most High God, who proclaim to us the way of salvation.' And this she did for many days." So some indication that they're there. They didn't just stay one night. They're there for many days. So we don't know exactly how long, but it doesn't say for weeks or for months or for years. It gives you some idea that this is probably, there have been there a week or 2 or something like that. I don't know exactly how long, but something in that range as opposed to one night or months and months. So she's basically following them around and saying that these are men of God, of the Most High God, and they're proclaiming to us the way of salvation. And this is, sometimes you're given little tidbits of information, and it's kind of hard to picture, and sometimes we don't picture the Apostle Paul like this. But it says, continuing in verse 18, see, I would have started a new verse right here. It says, "But Paul, greatly annoyed, turned and said to the Spirit, 'I command you in the name of Jesus Christ to come out of her.' And he came out that very hour. But when her masters saw that their hope of profit was gone, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace to the authorities." So now we've got Paul and Silas. Now they're the only 2 that are arrested, because as you noticed, Luke didn't include himself in this being taken and dragged in front of the authorities. So we've got this little bitty house church with Lydia and her household. Probably has some funds that they could do something with. But Paul's going to continue because he's staying with Lydia. They're all staying with Lydia and her household, but he's going to continue. And he's obviously going around and preaching. But this demon-possessed slave girl is following around and keeps yelling. And he gets annoyed and calls the demon out and leaves. And then the ones that owned this slave girl, they were making a lot of money on her. And they got annoyed. They got upset about it and said, all right, you've caused enough trouble. We're going to bring you in front of the authorities. So when you think about the letter to the church in Philippi, you have to remember what is happening here and the history that is about to take place with Paul and Silas. So they dragged them in front of the magistrates. So in verse 20 it says, and they brought them to the magistrates and said, these men, being Jews, exceedingly trouble our city. Now, the Jews in this, had they had 10 households of Jews, they most likely would have had a synagogue. So you got a big city and you got, basically a handful of Jews. And the only ones meeting down at the riverside are the women. And so now you've got a very small conversion, and these people are beginning to get upset because they're Paul and Silas and those that are with them are creating a ruckus. And certainly by taking away the profit center for the owners of this slave girl. So it says, these men being Jews exceedingly trouble our city, and they teach customs which are not lawful for us, being Romans, to receive or observe. Now, what did they not know at this time about Paul's citizenship, which they learn later? He's a Roman citizen, and they have an uh-oh moment at the end when they realize that. But Paul doesn't shout that out at the beginning. He kind of takes what they have to give. So they don't know. They just think they're Jews and they're there preaching Jewish things. They don't understand how Jesus fulfilled the Old Testament and was the Messiah and died on the cross and raised from the dead and ascended into heaven. I mean, they don't understand that. So if this is in AD 50 to 53, you're talking about 20 to 25 years, 20 or so years after Jesus' death, burial, resurrection, and ascension. So, if you think about, we're in 2020, if you think about back to the year 2000, that was before 9/11. So that's about how far we're going back to think about what your mindset's going to be. So can you even, it's hard for me even to go back to a mindset of pre-9/11. I mean, I'm sure that if you're old enough, you remember where you were when 9/11 happened. So go back, before that mindset. That's about how long it has been since Jesus was on the earth. So they're dragging Paul and Silas in front of the magistrates, in front of the authorities, because they've just now lost all their profit. So in verse 22, then the multitude rose up together against them, and the magistrates tore off their clothes and commanded them to be beaten with rods. And when they had laid many stripes on them, they threw them into prison, commanding the jailer to keep them securely. Having received such a charge, he put them into the inner prison, and they fastened their feet in the stocks. And that's why I think it's important that when we read the letter to the church in Philippi, you need to keep in context what Paul is going through. He's in prison, and he was imprisoned here, right? So he being a Roman citizen, which they didn't understand just yet, this was entirely improper for them to, without due process, to strip him of his clothes, beat him, and then throw him into prison, into the inner cell, and put him in shackles. I mean, you don't do that to a Roman citizen. Roman citizens have rights, and you don't do that to a Roman citizen. But this is what Paul is experiencing in Philippi when he then pens the letter to the church there. Any questions or comments about that so far? All right, we're not going to get finished with this. All right. We're at 7:21. Okay. So now a very familiar account to you. We have an earthquake, and the Philippian jailer is saved, right? He's not only saved physically, but he's saved spiritually, because he's about to commit suicide. Because what was the penalty for him letting prisoners escape? Death. So he was going to just take care of that himself. So starting in verse 25. I think I'm getting old, because I think I'm beginning to need reading glasses, but I'm fighting it as long as I possibly can. All right, 25. Maybe I hold it out a little bit. 25. But at midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the prisoners were listening to them. What a beautiful account of, can't you just picture that in your mind? It's midnight. You got all these prisoners with, open, they didn't have air conditioning. These aren't, closed buildings. They have windows. And so Paul and Silas have been beaten unlawfully, thrown into prison, and they are praying and singing, and all the other prisoners are listening. Now, what has the guard, the jailer, done? What he's not supposed to do. He fell asleep, right? So, verse 26, then suddenly there was a great earthquake, so that the foundations of the prison were shaken, and immediately all the doors were opened, and everyone's chains were loosed. And the keeper of the prison, awaking from sleep, that was his first mistake, and seeing the prison doors open, supposing the prisoners had fled, drew his sword and was about to kill himself. But Paul called with a loud voice, saying, do yourself no harm, for we are all here. So, what does that mean? Who are the two that were thrown into prison? We think, at least the indication is that Luke was not with them, because it says they, when he kind of removes himself with that personal pronoun. So they were dragged in front of the magistrates. They were beaten. They were thrown into prison. But he hasn't left the city, right? He's still witnessing all this. So it's Paul and Silas. But the great earthquake, all the doors were open, but who's still there? All the prisoners. What were all the prisoners doing at midnight? They were listening to Paul and Silas pray and sing. Think about the influence that they were having in such a short amount of time over the prisoners. Can you imagine being a prisoner and all of a sudden the guard is asleep, there's an earthquake, all the doors open and your shackles fall off. I think at least some of them may have been tempted to, I'm going to sneak out of here. But they're all still there. So Paul calls out to him, do yourself no harm, for we are all here. Then he called for a light, ran in, and fell down, trembling before Paul and Silas, and he brought them out and said, sirs, what must I do to be saved? What a beautiful question that he asks. This jailer is kneeling before prisoners who have just been beaten and thrown into prison. He's kneeling before them saying, what must I do to be saved? And this is a great verse as far as belief in baptism, if you look at these, how they're used interchangeably. Verse 31, so they said, believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and you will be saved, you and your household. Now, you may want to stop there, but you can't stop there. Verse 32, then they spoke the word of the Lord to him and to all who were in his house. And he took them the same hour that night and washed their stripes, and immediately he and his family were baptized. All right, now look at where it's used, baptized there, in verse 34. Now when he had brought them into his house, he set food before them, and he rejoiced, having believed in God with all his household. See how they're used almost interchangeably, believed and baptized are there. So this is, I'm going to have to stop, but this is the context of the beginnings of the church in Philippi. So we've got a household of Lydia, so a wealthy woman selling purple garments, her household. We've then got the Philippian jailer and his household. Whether the slave girl was converted or not, we don't know, but she obviously knew with the demon that they were men of God preaching the way of salvation. So we're not told specifically, but probably a safe presumption that they were. But now we've got the Philippian jailer and his household. Can you imagine how indebted he would feel to Paul and Silas, because he was about to kill himself? And now he and his entire household have been saved. And then we'll account the rest of it. The rest of the story is not as exciting as that. I mean, they kind of leave, but they have to leave. They're not just going to leave quietly. But that'll give you some context, and we'll finish this next week, Lord willing. Some context of when Paul pens this letter to the church in Philippi, his experiences there, because I don't think you can really understand that letter until you understand this context. So I hope that makes sense. We now have the opportunity, if you have any need, we've seen a couple of examples here. It doesn't take a lot to understand that you are not in a covenant relationship with God. It didn't take Lydia long. It didn't take her household long. It didn't take the Philippian jailer long to understand that they needed Christ in their life. So if you have that need, certainly we're here. If you have a need online, then certainly contact us. If you have any need, if you need the prayers of the church, please come forward as we stand and sing.